Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert McCauley. He is William Rand Kenan Jr. University Professor of Philosophy at the Center for Mind, Brain and Culture at Emory University. Dr. McCauley is a professor of philosophy, psychology, religion, and anthropology who is a pioneer in the cognitive science of religion. He is also the author of Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, and of Philosophical Foundations of the Cognitive Science of Religion, as well as the co-author with E. Thomas Lawson of both Bringing Ritual to Mind, Psychological Foundations of Cultural Forms, and Rethinking Religion, Connecting Cognition and Culture. Dr. McCauley is also the editor of the Churchlands and Their Critics, and the co-editor with Harvey Whitehouse of Mind and Religion. So, Dr. McCauley, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure.
Okay, so since you're one of the pioneering figures of the cognitive science of religion, Dr. McCauley, I would like to first ask you to tell us a little bit about the field and perhaps in what ways it differs from other fields and scientific disciplines when it comes to studying religion.
The field, I suppose, was started arguably, I guess, 3 decades ago now, or nearly 3 decades ago. There were multiple strands. I mean, Tom Lawson and I were one of those strands, but in Paris, Dan Sperber's group and Pascal Boyer were sort of pursuing similar ideas. And in some ways, we were all prefigured by work by Stuart Guthrie. He published a paper, I guess, about 1980 or so, in which he sort of said, could there be a cognitive theory of religion, and then proposed his sort of anthropomorphic account. All of us, in short, had the view that there was this new exciting set of developments in the study of human minds and human behavior called cognitive science, or the cognitive sciences, and that they were, really by the 1980s, they were thriving. Each of us sort of had the view that these tools and methods and findings and theories could be brought to bear on thinking about religion, and presumably productively so. You asked, in short, there was a sort of confluence of interests arising from these different sources. Lawson and I guess, published the first book, Rethinking Religion, which came out in 1990. But then over the next decade or so, there was just a host of folks who started picking up on some of these ideas. And I remember, it's a while ago now, but Jason Sloan argued, I believe it was, that 2002 was the tipping point in which he counted more than a dozen books in the cognitive science of religion coming out that year. One might sort of say the rest is history. There has been greater proliferation and wider interest across the world. And frankly, it seems to me that the cognitive science of religion is probably better represented in Europe than it is in North America, but well represented in both places. And likewise now in New Zealand and Australia and around the world. How it differs from other approaches to religion concerns, I suppose you could divide it up into sort of considerations of methods and substantive considerations. In short, first of all, and this might sound like a funny thing to start with, but it's explicitly theoretical. All analysis involves making selection amongst materials about what you think is important, and That is to say that all analysis is finally informed by theories, and the question is whether or not you even know what theory it is that informs the analysis that you're offering. The cognitive science of religion, I think it's fair to say, like all science, is devoted to sort of making those theories as explicit as possible, to figure out their implications in sometimes excruciating detail. And that's a different sort of endeavor than to, sort of have a set of sensibilities and a set of filters, but not being clear about what the theoretical principles are. The second difference is simply, again, a kind of general feature of all sciences, which is to say that there is a concern with empirical and finally, if possible, experimental tractability for these theories. Ultimately, the hope is their testability. I take it that stands in some contrast to, the methods of many of the social sciences and the humanities, where the focus is on sort of the reports of informants or participant observation. It's not to say that these things aren't valuable. They are valuable and they are worthwhile. It's just to say that this is a different set of methods that can be brought to bear, and hopefully productively. On the substantive side, I think that the most striking contrast is going to be the interest of cognitive scientists in what has come to be called implicit cognition, as opposed to sort of what people explicitly think and consciously entertain about how their minds work or what they're thinking or how their thoughts are connected with their conduct and so on. The emphasis on implicit cognition is to suggest that there are a host of mental systems that operate almost exclusively, pretty much below the level of consciousness. This informs a great deal of our intuition about how we manage in the world in a variety of different domains. These systems tend to be automatic. The judgments come instantaneously. I mean, if I look at someone and draw an inference, it's usually instantaneous, say, about their emotional state, for example. These capacities are mostly inarticulate, which is to say that if they're not conscious and you're not even aware of them, then you're unlikely to be talking about them. But even if you are sort of working hard at and thinking about these matters and sort of, how it is that you understand that certain linguistic strings are well-formed or things like that, or ill-formed, it turns out it's not so easy to sort of say how we know these things. So that's one, I think, fairly striking difference, in contrast to, say, having an informant who provides you their conscious, explicit thoughts about the arrangements. What you're interested in are sort of underlying cognitive forces and patterns and mechanisms that, in fact, drive an awful lot of human mental life and conduct. So the interest is, unlike standard religious studies, which is so often struck with the diversity of religion around the world, I mean, the cognitive science of religion is interested in finding underlying uniformities beneath that diversity, and those in particular that are cognitively grounded. I mean, you look at largely the same phenomena. I mean, it's not as if myth and ritual and icons and priestly hierarchies and all of those things, shamans and so on. I mean, they are still the stuff that make up what we count as religions. But the take on them is going to be, again, with different tools, different methods, different theories, and from a rather different angle. I guess the final quick comment I'd make about this is also that the cognitive science of religion stands also apart from, I would say, a lot of traditional psychology of religion in the following respect, and that is that it's not one might say it's not as Jamesian. That is,
you're referring to William James there, correct?
Exactly. And in his, classic work on the varieties of religious experience, James says explicitly that what he's interested in is emotion and the sort of strong emotional dimensions of varieties of religious experience. And then he also says explicitly that he is interested in sort of the great religious adepts, the people who are really the extraordinary leaders of religions and who have had wondrous experiences and so on. And CSR, by contrast, CSR is the standard acronym used in the field to stand for Cognitive Science of Religion. CSR, by contrast, it's not to say that emotion doesn't matter. Of course it does. But the focus in CSR is going to principally be on cognition rather than emotion. And because there's such a concern with the transmission of religious materials, the interest is going to be not on sort of what's so extraordinary, but rather things, so to speak, that can kind of get packaged and transmitted from one generation to the next. It's not to say that there aren't extraordinary religious people in the history of humankind. Of course there are. There are no doubt thousands of them. But in order to transmit the kinds of insights, the kinds of ideas that get connected with those experiences, they've got to come in forms that, as it were, can be available to the millions, the tens of millions, the hundreds of millions, not those few thousands who might have these rather extraordinary experiences. So in that regard also, even amongst scientific approaches to religion, there is a difference in emphasis. That's all.
Okay, and let us just talk a little bit more about. Okay, so until the development of the field of the cognitive science of religion, wouldn't you say that perhaps the way people approached religion, perhaps from a sociological, psychological, or even anthropological perspective, that they tended to be too centered on religion as a cultural phenomenon and try to explain it from cultural differences between different peoples, and perhaps the way religion got expressed in different human societies? They tended to look too much or focus too much on the cultural aspects of it, and perhaps neglected a little bit, or thought that it was really not that important to try to get down at the biological / cognitive foundations of religion, and that perhaps are universal to all human societies.
I'm sure I buy the premise of the question. The interest in culture has been widespread across many of the social sciences, and frankly across the humanities as well. And there have been, again, valuable insights that arose from that approach. But I think that finally, it has typically operated with what you might call an unexplicated concept of culture. Culture is sort of treated as a force. Now, I mean, I understand that this was something the social sciences are inevitably sort of foisted with, or have to deal with. Economists talk about market forces. Well, finally, what are these things? Are they some kind of metaphysical mystery, or can we give a more fine-grained analytical account of what they might involve? And there is a broader movement. It's not something that's confined to CSR. about an interest in sort of bringing selectionist models, broadly speaking, to these kinds of problems. Some are evolutionary, some are epidemiological, and there are various differences in those two orientations, but they do share a kind of interest in the notion that there are sort of selection forces out there, where culture is now seen instead as not as some mysterious, rather vague force, but in effect patterns of mental representations in populations of human minds, and combined with sets of public representations that are available to those minds. It seems to me to operate with the kind of vague notion of culture leaves you with a less rich notion that, as I said, kind of is unexplicated. You don't have a good sense of what its origins are, or about the details that, at least in CSR, a lot of people have been very interested in trying to say some things about, and that is the connections between what we see as culture and its foundations, those connections and foundations in evolved dispositions of minds, how culture operates, how it has an influence. I guess what I would say is that too often it seems to me, it does seem to me to be a fair criticism to say that too often culture has been deployed as a kind of what philosophers would call a kind of unanalyzed primitive. So to that extent, it seems to me the cognitive sciences are welcome in making a contribution on this front, to the extent that they can provide more detailed accounts, more fine-grained accounts of how such forces or such putative forces operate. A colleague of mine, I mean, this is not directly about the cognitive science of religion, but a prominent cognitive scientist, Paul Thagard, now is coming out with a 3-volume work in which he's looking at the promise of the cognitive sciences to contribute to the social sciences, not to displace them. I want to stress that, but to supplement them, to enhance them, to interdigitate with them. I suppose, again, when those positions that focus on sort of what I've been at least characterizing as a somewhat vague notion of culture, there is also, again, a kind of inattention to what might be underlying general patterns, and that lie beneath all of that marvelous diversity that makes up either religion or language or political systems or economies or anything that we count as social and cultural. I suppose the other crucial advantage, it seems to me, is just that, and this is true about all of science, scientists are so wonderfully opportunistic in that they look for evidence wherever they can find it. And to that extent, the cognitive sciences, again, bring a whole collection of tactics and strategies and tools and methods that can generate new forms of evidence. That can be a vital contribution to sort of, as I've said, sort of enriching this notion of culture.
Okay, so with all of that in mind, and because I've already had doctors Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson on the show, would you agree that we should approach culture as another biological phenomenon? And I guess that we could put it in two different ways. Perhaps on the one hand, approaching it that way allows for us to better understand what are the cognitive mechanisms that humans share that underlie and give rise to culture, cultural phenomena, cultural transmission, and all other things like that. And on the other hand, it also allows for us to better understand. So when we study other cultures, there is cross-cultural variation, but we also have human universals, and to better understand in what ways culture vary from one another, because I mean it's not really a random phenomena when it comes to cultural variation, right? It has some underlying common features, correct?
Sure. I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on Rob or Pete's positions. I mean, I've read some of their work, and I know them, and I admire them and admire their work. I mean, remember, I'm a philosopher. You know, at one level, sure, all of culture is part of nature. If we produce culture and we're natural organisms, you know, then arguably culture is a biological phenomenon. I suppose one of the hesitations I have sometimes about this is that it seems to me that what we're talking about mostly is as I've said, sort of broadly speaking, one might say the deployment of Darwinian ideas. And I don't know, the point in part is that is a set of theoretical tools that I don't know that have to be confined to biology or, you know, I mean, if in sort of the insistence that culture might be finally best understood as biology, it seems to me to make good sense in the first sense that I noted, namely that, you know, all of culture is part of nature because we're natural organisms. Similarly, if the suggestion that Darwinian methods may prove productive in understanding culture, its dynamics, its origins, its operations. But, you know, sort of, it doesn't follow from that there isn't a whole set of discussions that are perfectly viable and worthwhile to be having about culture. You know, one might say at the cultural level, but I would add also at the psychological level. So often I find that folks who are excited about evolution, justifiably, tend to kind of skip a level. That is to say, they're interested in the biological roots of culture. But intervening between biology and culture is indeed psychology and cognition. What Darwin's given us is a theory for very, very long-term time frames and very, very large-scale systems. But working out the details of that story always comes down to looking at what are known, you know, in short, as proximate mechanisms. And that's where it seems to me the psychology and the focus on cognition has a very valuable contribution to make. How is it that these selection forces operate? How is it that ideas, for example, are things that might be described as something that can get replicated without having to make reference to genes and genetic considerations there. I mean, another kind of, I suppose, very, very minor kind of concern that a philosopher might operate with is simply the notion that sometimes, I suppose, certain natural phenomena that are not biological may ultimately have a place in culture. Erupting volcanoes, impending hurricanes. You know, there are any number of things that folks all over the world, for example, pray about and are deeply concerned about that are not biological phenomena. But I think that's fair to say is only a minor philosophical worry. You know, that much of culture should be, and indeed I'm arguing, you know, principally, or at least well, I shouldn't say principally, I'll say valuably understood as the impact of public and mental representations on other mental representations in a population of organisms, and in that sense, biological, you know, sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you talk about kind of third stage...
Sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you talk about a kind of third stage that is an intermediary stage between biology and culture, and you refer to it as being psychology and cognition. Could you explain how we then get from cognition or psychology to culture? Is it through studying the cognitive processes that operate in our mind and that are innate to us, or what exactly? Or what exactly?
Well, to get from cognition to culture, at least in the cognitive science of religion, the overwhelming focus has been on how certain dispositions of mind that are described variously. Sometimes people have used language like innate. Sometimes people have used what I take to be a somewhat more nuanced term by saying that they're evolved capacities. If in my book that you mentioned, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, I coin a notion of calling them maturationally natural capacities. The argument is that these capacities arise pretty regularly in just about every human mind. There are a few kinds of problems that can arise, just like any kind of biological system. But that these evolved psychological proclivities to some extent in effect serve as sort of selection mechanisms, mechanisms of selection on the kinds of cultural representations that are going to enjoy widespread popularity. I mean, I've discussed this in the context of religion, and I'm sure we'll go on to do that at some length. People who are working in artificial intelligence have been able to design programs that can make really good predictions about what forms of popular music will in fact be successful. It's again picking up on this notion that there are sort of dispositions of mind that humans find particularly appealing. Claude Lévi-Strauss famously said that there are just certain sorts of ideas that humans like to think. We like to think about agents, and we like to think about what they do and their states of mind, and we like to think about those kinds of representations. So in that sense, again, broadly, in a kind of broadly Darwinian framework, what we're looking at is the notion that these cognitive proclivities exert an influence on the kinds of representations that are likely to pop up, but more importantly, on the kinds that are likely to survive. Songs that will go to the top of the charts in contrast to songs that just sort of disappear. But no less so, religions that will go to the top of the charts and religions that will disappear. As a kind of avocational interest, I have to say that I've had a long-standing interest in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, partly because of Rodney Stark's influence, pointing out that it's grown with astonishing rapidity. It turns out that, at least on my and Tom Lawson's account of ritual, they may have some rituals that are, it turns out, quite good for religions to have, let's put it that way, and that will make them appealing. So that's the principal sense in which cognition, as it were, we can work up from cognition to culture, that these cognitive dispositions of mind in effect set constraints on the kinds of cultural forms that are likely to fare well. Did you ask me about getting from culture to cognition, or?
Well, if you want to talk about it, because I guess that we can also do it both ways, right?
Sure. Exactly. And I mean, it can indeed go both ways. And not can, it does indeed go both ways. Um, I mean, when you start thinking about all the sort of natural candidates of these, what I've been calling these dispositions of mind, it's just patent in some cases that that culture is tuning these systems. I mean, the most conspicuous illustration of that, of course, is going to be natural language. If you're born, where I was born, you grow up speaking American English. If you are born in China, at least, large parts of China, you grow up speaking Mandarin. If you grow up and you can move babies from one place to the other, and sure enough, they'll pick up the language that's there locally. That one, as I said, is sort of obvious. But I would argue that there's lots of evidence that culture tunes a number of these other systems that are much less obvious, even down to visual perception. Joe Henrik and I have written a paper on that that we published about 10 years ago. But people's susceptibility to visual illusions turns out to be a function of the cultural setting they've been in for about it looks like about the first 20, 22, 23 years of your life. Lo and behold, that's also about exactly the same amount of time that we have evidence that sort of general brain growth is going on in humans. I mean, there's other growth that occurs after that age, but it tends to be focused and idiosyncratic from one individual to the next. But this susceptibility, for example, to certain visual illusions seems to be something that kind of gets in place in those first 20 years, and the cultural milieu looks to be the crucial factor that shapes it. Why? Well, I mean, it's one argument about our species is that our greatest trick is not gigantic brains. There are some other critters that have got gigantic brains, including some of our close cousins like the Neanderthals. But rather, it's not just gigantic brains, but it was getting those brains out of the womb at a very, very early stage and leaving them working such that they have a kind of plasticity to rewire themselves for at least a couple of decades. And of course, the point is that the setting in which they rewire themselves certainly is a richly cultural setting. And so it looks like this capacity to acquire and propagate culture is a pretty important variable as well. There are studies, for example, neuroimaging studies looking at Americans and folks in China, and looking at them when they're contemplating other people, pictures of other people that they don't know, pictures of their mothers, and pictures of themselves. Without going into the details, about which I'm not an expert anyway, what the findings are is that amongst this Chinese population, mother and self patterns of activation in their brains are significantly different from the patterns for seeing other people. With Americans, it's mother and others that are grouped and have similar levels of activation, and it's the viewing of self that is set apart. I mean, it looks like culture's had a big impact there, and it squares with the sort of reports carried out by folks who do traditional sorts of work on, American individualistic culture and culture in China. I confess, I've been hugely influenced by my good friend and colleague Joe Henrik's book, The Secret of Our Success, that came out a couple of years ago now, where Joe makes an extended and detailed case for the vital importance of the role of culture as generated, accumulated, transmitted, and stored knowledge across a population that's distributed across a population that is just absolutely vital to all sorts of human endeavors, human cognitive achievements, and so on. And I heartily recommend the book, and it will give you, as I suspect you may well know, I mean, dozens of wonderful illustrations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but just before we get into the next topic, all of what you just presented there. Okay, but just before we get into the next topic, all of what you just presented there in terms of how culture and language might influence our cognition and the way we think and see and even perceive the world, isn't that a case for what linguists would call, I guess, weak Worfianism? Because I guess that the specific cases where language influences the way we perceive certain aspects of the world are very limited to very restrict examples. Like, for example, some things that come to my mind right now are the studies where they ask people from different cultures to name colors that they are not familiar with, and perhaps they take a little longer than people who are part of our culture, for example, to name certain colors, not because they don't exactly see them and they don't notice the difference, they do, but it seems that because they lack the words for that specific color, that it is a bit more difficult for them to really identify it or to say that they see it and what color it is about. And then there are other examples as well from people that come from certain tribes where instead of using a spatial orientation system as we do of front, back, left and right, they use the cardinal system with north, south, east and west or something like that. But it seems that even in those cases, when people are instructed to use a system that is different from the one that comes from their culture, they are fairly able to do it after a short period of training. So I guess that what I'm trying to say here is that perhaps those sorts of influences that coming from culture and language that change the way we perceive the world, that are somewhat limited and that don't change really our innate underlying cognitive systems in a permanent way, let's say.
Well, that's interesting.
Let's say.
Well, that's interesting. I do know broadly about a lot of the research that you just pointed to. I think you've done a great job of giving a gloss on it and capturing the issues. I've never thought of myself as a weak Worfian before. I guess the only weak Worfian response I would give that seems to me probably matters here is that the point about the illusions is that they are lasting illusions. They don't go away. And to the extent that you get variability across cultures, it does suggest that culture is playing a role and again, the term I would prefer is tuning these systems. I'm actually right now in the midst of reading Cecilia Hayes' book Cultural Gadgets, and I mean, she's arguing for a much stronger position, and that is that that culture in effect really makes these systems rather than just tunes them. On the basis of really pretty minimal native resources. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be my only kind of weak Worfian response, and that is that the persistence of illusions is an interesting phenomenon, and it turns out you basically, it doesn't look like you can train people out of these illusions or their susceptibility to these illusions, either to have it or not to have it. And certainly once they get to be adults. One of the most famous studies was carried out by one of my, a man I was lucky enough to meet back when I was a very young guy, Donald Campbell. But Siegel, Herskovitz, and Campbell's research, cross-cultural research on visual illusions, which is what Henrik and I report about in our paper. It turned out the crucial case was South Africa. And the reason for that is in the bad old days of the apartheid system, folks who had grown up in the hinterlands came to the urban areas and the near urban areas to work in an urban setting and work in mines. And it turned out that whether or not they were susceptible to a host of visual illusions overwhelmingly seemed to depend upon what the age was when they came to the city. And the findings were, as I was suggesting, if they come after their early 20s, they are, for example, not susceptible to the Mueller-Lyer illusion. But if they come before their early 20s, they, like I suspect both you, well, I know me and I suspect you as well, turn out to be hugely susceptible to the Mueller-Lyer illusion and a variety of others. That puts a little backbone in that weak Orpheanism, I guess.
Right. Okay, and so do you think that we can establish a parallel between these aspects of culture and how culture and language... Right. Okay, and so do you think that we can establish a parallel between these aspects of culture and how culture and language might influence our cognitive systems, or tune them, as you say, between that and perhaps the work coming from people like Noam Chomsky and others, where when dealing with language they say that there are certain innate aspects to it, in the sense that we have evolved specific cognitive systems to acquire language from our environment, but the specific language that we acquire depends on the one or the ones that we are exposed to during our several developmental stages and our developmental period. And I mean, and perhaps when we acquire one or two of them during certain critical periods, beyond that, they render it more difficult to become fluent in other languages, something like that, right?
Yeah, that certainly looks, I mean, at a certain level of description, that looks like it's a pretty accurate account of language. Those of us like myself who, sort of struggled and sweated through one semester after another of language courses when I was an adolescent and young adult. That was the one sort of part of intellectual life that never came easily to me. This notion that it's quite different from a youngster who's simply sort of in that linguistic setting and capable of acquiring the language, it seems, effortlessly. I'm not quite sure how to handle your question, to be honest, beyond what I've already said. I mean, I think that the language issue is a huge one. One of the things, I'll make an observation or two about it that I hope you'll find worthwhile. I think that ever since Chomsky's early work, very quickly critics arose to argue that his attempt to try to sort of completely isolate, from a theoretical standpoint, syntax from semantics in particular, has been a kind of a sore point for decades now, and a variety of people, beginning all the way back with George Lakoff and the generative semantics movement, but coming right through to so-called constructionist grammars and so on. Folks are trying to argue that those border lines are not so distinct. I think that my sense is that oftentimes these discussions seem to be like ships passing in the night. Which is to say that the nativists, the folks who like that kind of story, overwhelmingly tend to focus on syntax. The folks who are much more interested in the role of learning and culture and the influence of rather more general purpose learning strategies tend to focus on semantics and pragmatics. I don't want to pretend I'm an expert on these things. I'm not. And I should add semantics, pragmatics, and phonology. Syntax seems to sort of sit in a slightly different area. I should stress that although I'm very, very interested in language as a traditionally natural, evolved capacity, again, it's not unlike this comment about Cecilia Hayes's new book. This seems to me finally an argument about degrees. That is to say, how much wiring do you need sort of in there prefiguring responses? There are a host of folks out there offering really interesting work on general trends in brain development and the evolution of brains that suggest that you don't need a sort of special mutation for every new little trick that humans turn out to be capable of exhibiting. And I find that work interesting and compelling. I tend to kind of exasperate friends on both sides of this divide by simply saying that I'm dedicated to sort of following the science wherever it takes us. Yeah, I think that pretty much says what I can say in a short time for purposes of this interview.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's just take a little step back to talk about the cognitive aspects that are specifically associated with religion and religious. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's just take a little step back to talk about the cognitive aspects that are specifically associated with religion and religious phenomena. Because from the work of some people I get that there are certain specific aspects of cognition that get studied in the cognitive science of religion. Like, for example, I recall reading about core knowledge that is folk psychology, which nowadays is known as theory of mind, folk biology and folk physics. So could you tell us about these things, and also what other aspects of cognition people in the cognitive science of religion usually deal with?
Sure. I mean, now you're getting quite
religion usually deal with.
Sure. I mean, now you're getting quite a position. The suggestion is of a piece with the earlier comments I made about the sort of working up from cognition to culture, that we can work up from cognition to culture with regard to religion, and that the strategy, at least one of the strategies that's out there, is and it has been. It's probably fair to say it's been the most prominent of the strategies. It's not the only one, but and that's broadly what I'd call sort of the byproduct theory. That religion or features of religions are either spandrels or exaptations, depending on whether or not you think they're functional. In some way or other. But the notion is that there are systems in there. For example, the detection of agents in your environment, the detection of agents with sophisticated intentional states, and the ability to kind of draw inferences about those states. And then a host of other kinds of capacities, because these are quite diverse. And that's something I want to stress. Theory of mind tends to sort of get a lot of the attention. It's big across the cognitive sciences, and it's big in the cognitive science of religion. Why? Well, because it informs things like myth and a focus on narrative. Likewise, an understanding of action and action representation is a sort of subset of theory of mind. That's going to pertain to ritual and other kinds of religious action. But there are a host of other capacities that the cognitive scientists of religion have also pointed to. So, for example, an interest in humans' caution and precautions concerned with contaminants in their environment. The notion that this isn't something that you have to sort of teach, that like language, it looks like it's something that kids kind of acquire without any explicit instruction.
Does that have something to do with the literature on the emotion of disgust?
Sure, exactly. I mean, some of the things you find disgusting are things that in effect are contaminants in this rather more broad and generic sense. Exactly. Well, how does this connect with religion? Well, the point is that this kind of, these sensibilities can be cued very easily. And of course, that's the point again about maturationally natural systems, right? They're automatic, they're instantaneous, they're unconscious, they're mostly inarticulate, they run in parallel, which is to say they're incredibly fast, instantaneous. Don't mean to be repetitive. Likewise, our sensitivity about the notion that there's contaminant in our environment. Well, the point is, Jerry Fodor in his book Modularity of Mind famously cited the humorous American poet Ogden Nash, in which Nash says, alluding to telephones, you know, it's a joke though. I mean, if it's a panther, don't anther. You know, the notion is that there are just certain kinds of dangers in the environment that you need to have lightning fast reflex responses to, including the presence of a predator or a potential predator right there in your vicinity. Likewise, the presence of a contaminant. So the notion is that these are, a word that I often use is they're really stupid systems. All they need to be sort of cued and they kick into gear. So we can easily cue contamination avoidance. All you have to do is, for example, when you're walking in a space, is to walk a circuitous path to get to your goal that is unimpeded, or at least apparently unimpeded. Well, why didn't you just walk straight from point A to point B? Well, this is a way that we could cue contamination, right? And that is we take a circuitous path around a certain part of the space. And if we do that repeatedly, everybody knows what's going on. There's something special about that space. I've got to be wary, cautious, concerned about my relationship and spatial relationship with that. Likewise with, you know, dealing with particular objects or something like that. But a host of other capacities, face recognition. You know, it's not a coincidence that religious icons routinely, you know, I mean, they have faces. Indeed, they conform to a variety of principles about the natural world. So they exhibit, typically well, virtually always, they exhibit vertical symmetry. And the things that exhibit vertical symmetry in the world are critters, are animals. When you face them particularly straight on. Kinship awareness. Deborah Lieberman at the University of Miami has done all sorts of wonderful research looking at, it looks like we've got these unconscious cues about who our cognitive systems are calculating are likely our kin. Well, religions know how to sort of pick up on those sorts of concepts and also how to cue them. And we are all, after all, brothers in Christ, you know, the family of God and so on. I mean, that kind of kinship language is quite routine. Priests are called fathers. Nuns are called sisters. I mean, one that, to go back to a case we've already discussed, but in a different way now, language. I mean, humans have this automatic recognition of language, and we process language automatically. Famously, you know, I mean, if you hear certain sound, you can't hear language as just sound. If it's a language you're familiar with. And frankly, you can't even hear language that you're not so familiar with, even just as sound, an awful lot of the time. The semantic processors just go right into gear. And religions know how to do this. It's called glossolalia. It's called xenoglossia. The notion that more commonly so-called speaking in tongues. People start making utterances. When human minds get that stuff as input, immediate inference is this must be language. Next immediate inference is if it's language, it must mean something. Next inference is if it means something, it would be good if I could figure out what it means. You know, this is, note what you're doing there. I mean, people talk all the time, but that's not what's going on here in the way that religion enlists this maturationally natural system of language for attention-grabbing representations. You mentioned folk biology. I mean, most of what I've been, well, sorry, I started out talking about folk psychology. Now I'm talking about some things that are neither really folk, some of them I guess were folk biological. But, you know, I mean, part of folk biology is biological essentialism. It is the notion that species are fixed kinds, that they have essences. The essences are usually hidden. Something inside them makes them what they are. It indeed makes them exactly what they are. So, you know, my 4-year-old granddaughter is quite clear that mommy and daddy ponies do not have piggies for babies. And no one's taught that to her. No one lays that out explicitly. She's already got that framework there. How do religions engage this? Well, in an awful lot of religions, priestly castes are, in effect, biologically understood. That is to say that there's some essence, again, a biological essence they have, that it's hereditary, and so on. I don't mean to go on. I mean, another wonderful illustration here, especially if you live where I do. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the southeastern United States. You can get in your car and drive about, I mean, actually, you don't have to drive very far at all, but let's say 100 miles north of here, and with a little bit of, you know, discrete inquiry, you can find snake handling churches. And of course, this is rooted, as they would tell you, and correctly so, it's rooted in the Christian Bible. Right? This notion of sort of holding serpents. I mean, you want to talk about something that will fix attention instantly and about which people are instantly cautious and therefore hugely impressed. So the notion is there's a diversity of these kinds of systems that have pertained to human survival, that they can be enlisted by religions. I mean, look, religions are not the only things that enlist these, and that's an important point to make. I mean, it sounds so odd to say, but the cognitive science of religion provides real insight about at least 2 other major areas of modern human life that seem completely, well, in one case, maybe not completely unrelated, but, and that is militaries and advertising. I mean, the kinds of dispositions of mind that cognitive scientists of religion point to are precisely the ones that advertisers also know how to manipulate in order to grab human attention, to create cultural representations that are going to thrive. Militaries also, the only thing that is more ritualized than religion is militaries. There's a reason for that. And it has to do with, you know, sort of creating this notion that that there are, well, it turns out there are a host of, this is where we get into questions of function, but there are a host of sort of consequences of having things like having people march together in synchrony and so on, quite like rituals.
Mhm. Yes, and that point I think it's very important to make here because wouldn't you say that, I mean, religion, even though it has all of these complex biological and cultural aspects to it, I mean, from a cognitive perspective and in terms of its cognitive basis, it is not really a phenomenon that is completely separated from others because the underlying cognitive mechanisms that operate in religion, I mean,
People march together in synchrony and so on, quite like rituals.
yes, and that point I think it's very important to make here because wouldn't you say that, I mean, religion, even though it has all of these complex biological and cultural aspects to it, I mean, from a cognitive perspective and in terms of its cognitive basis, it is not really a phenomenon that is completely separated from others because the underlying cognitive mechanisms that operate in religion, I mean, they are also shared by other human cultural manifestations, right?
Sure, sure. Sure. As I just said, I mean, advertisers know what gets people's attention. I mean, one of the things you have mentioned here is, sexual displays. Needless to say, advertisers are experts at that. But yeah, as I've said, advertising and the military are sort of the two areas of life that, on the face of it, don't seem to have an obvious compatibility or resonance with religion. But and the cognitive scientists of religion have argued, yeah, there are actually a number of very, very interesting connections between these similarities. As I said, they're engaging similar systems. The notion is, if these maturationally natural systems are ones that are easily cued, right, then the aim is to create cultural representations that are going to push the relevant buttons. And when you push those buttons, you get a predictable response. That's what makes up things from the structure of folk tales to armies marching around to advertisers so wonderfully finding ways to grab and hold our attention. I should add another feature of this is actually also software, our sort of new social media companies, any number of companies that are out there. I mean, what a huge portion of folks who work for Facebook or for Google or for any of these other large companies are devoting 8 hours a day to studying, actually probably more than that, is ways to keep your eyes glued to their screens. And so they know what kind of reinforcement schedules to use, when the precise timing of when particular things will pop up, for example. These are all closely related sorts of inquiries.
Yes, and perhaps we could expand a little bit more on this later in the interview because we're going to talk also about why religion is natural and
all closely related sorts of inquiries.
Yes, and perhaps we could expand a little bit more on this later in the interview because we're going to talk also about why religion is natural and science is not, as is the title of one of your books. But I mean, I guess that this is where I get a bit frustrated with people like the new atheists because they seem to approach religion in a way that they sort of want to make of religion as if it is something that is special in terms of promoting dogmatism and tribalism and an anti-scientific approach to the world and things like that. But I mean, there are a lot of other human cultural manifestations, as we've been talking about here, that also promote exactly those sorts of things and that have innate biases and heuristics that operate in our mind as their basis of operation, let's say, right?
Yeah, I mean, actually, perhaps you've given to say something that I should.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, actually, perhaps you've given to say something that I should have perhaps said right at the outset, and I apologize for failing to have done so. One of the deepest commitments of folks who work in the cognitive science of religion has been that, in short, from a cognitive standpoint, that there's actually little, very, very little, if anything, there may be a few things, but not much that is particularly special at all about religious cognition. It's perfectly normal cognition. It's perfectly ordinary cognition that gets, as you've correctly pointed out, and we've been discussing for the last 5 minutes or so, a host of other cultural systems also are manipulating the same kinds of cognitive dispositions of mind. That nothing about religious cognition is sort of out of the ordinary or special. It's perfectly normal cognition. That's why there are these recurrent features that underlie religions. Yeah, I mean, with regard to the so-called the new atheists, I mean, broadly, I concur with what you said. The two, I guess, that seem to me to have made the most reference to the work in the cognitive science of religion are Dawkins and Dennett. Dennett, because it seems to me he has multiple agendas, and one of them is one that's extremely friendly to the cognitive science of religion. He thinks that, yeah, religion is a phenomenon that can be studied by science just like anything else, and hey, these guys over here, the cognitive scientists, they've already been doing it, and it's great. Then he also has another agenda that's much closer to sort of what you've called the new atheists. In Dawkins' God Delusion book, it seemed, he also makes reference to some of the research that's been done. I'm not sure he sufficiently appreciates it, though, because there's a sense in which really one of the points is that, in short, religion isn't going to go away. This is of a piece with, the title of my book, Religion, Why Religion is Natural. It's cognitively natural, and natural, of course, in English carries multiple senses of the term. I mean, it's got lots of different meanings. One of those meanings is if you say somebody's a natural, you mean that something comes really easy to them. In baseball, famously, terrific young baseball players who seem particularly promising are often called naturals. And that's another sense that I certainly wanted to play on in the title of the book. And this is something that I think that the new atheists maybe haven't sufficiently appreciated. And that is, the argument's going to be, it's not for religion or against religion. That's not really the point. The point of the scientific research is to say, there's a reason why religions just keep popping up in human populations, and they don't go away. I mean, there's some interest in whether or not they will go away. I mean, with secularized societies in Northern Europe in particular. There's a whole lot to say about that, and I could, but I don't mean to get you off. I'll let you proceed with your own agenda here.
Okay. So now the next topic would be ritual in religion, because I guess that this is another very interesting aspect of religion.
In Northern Europe in particular. There's a whole lot to say about that, and I could, but I don't mean to get you off. I'll let you proceed with your own agenda here.
Okay. So now the next topic would be ritual in religion, because I guess that this is another very interesting aspect of religion. Perhaps how ritual both communicates social information to people and also renders them or creates some sort of mental state in them that render them more predisposed to incorporate certain religious knowledge or something like that. So could you tell us about the importance of rituals in religion, perhaps in the light of modes theory, including both the doctrinal and the imagistic mode?
Okay, that's a lot of issues there that you're asking about. Maybe I'll start at the end and move forward, which is to say some things about my relationship to the modes theory and my relationship to my good friend Harvey Whitehouse. Um, this actually goes back to questions about sort of the early days of cognitive science of religion. It's not, I mean, I don't mean to sort of take on an honorific mantle here, but this is a sort of illustration of independent invention in science. It's happened lots of times in the history of science. And in the early and mid 90s, Whitehouse was interested in issues of the connections between ritual and memory in particular. And so were Lawson and I. And candidly, I mean, we worked these things out largely independently of one another, and then eventually found out that we were sort of exploring very, very similar lines of research and very similar lines of analysis. This is one of those situations where I always joke that you know, the most animated arguments that you can have are the arguments with people in your own family. So in my intellectual family, Harvey is a virtually you know, a very close relative, and we've often had extended arguments about the comparatively fine details, I suspect, from the standpoint of an outsider, with regard to these questions about ritual. Generally, Lawson and I kind of laid out our biggest take on this in the second book, Bringing Ritual to Mind. I would say broadly that we had two kinds of objections. The first one was a certain vagueness about that surrounded the modes theory, about the modes themselves. You know, are they discussions about individual psychology or social collectives, and if the answer is both, then, you know, well, what's the connection, and so on. You know, can there be, how does the doctrinal mode even arise in sort of human groups? I mean, where does that come from? There's a much more, it seems to me, richly psychologically rooted story to tell about the imagistic stuff, and Harvey's done magnificent research on this in the last 15, 20 years or so. The second was, in terms of issues of vagueness, is vagueness about what counts as the frequency of ritual performance, because it looks like that matters a lot. It matters a lot in his theory and a lot of theories, but especially in his theory. There are some rituals you do a lot of times. There are other rituals you may do only one time. And sort of, what's the difference? But in addition, you know, what counts as doing a ritual? Do you have to be participating in the ritual, or does it count that you're sitting in the congregation when somebody else is getting married and you're watching their wedding? So, you know, sort of how you even make these decisions about what counts as frequency. So vagueness on those two fronts. What are the modes, and what counts as ritual performances that get counted in frequency, measures of frequency? The other argument we made is just that, you know, I mean, similarly as theory can't explain some things our theory explains about features of rituals, which are the ones that get repeated frequently, which are ones that can be reversed. So there's been a long history of us sort of interacting. Harvey has responded to us, and, you know, we've done other work subsequently, but we all certainly agree that ritual is an important religious gadget, like all those other gadgets we were talking about a little while ago, from snake handling to speaking in tongues to any number of other things. That it is connected with memory. The standard story that we explored in the early days was, if you do something frequently, it gets in memory. It gets in memory as a schema, a kind of script. And there isn't so much recollection for specific episodes as just a sort of general pattern that you're quite familiar with, and that's in contrast to the rituals where there's sort of lots of excitement. I mean, in fact, the stuff that you do over and over again tends to get pretty routine. At least when Harvey did his ethnography in Melanesia, the suggestion was that the stuff just gets downright boring after a while. He studies a group that basically goes through a ritual cycle every 2 weeks. And I mean, that means 26 times a year, 260 times every 10 years. I mean, it's you experience these a lot. By contrast, there are these sort of exciting rituals, weddings. The term we coined was sensory pageantry. They're loaded with sensory pageantry. They get you excited. I mean, if you stimulate people's sensory systems, it has an emotional impact on them. Whether it's bright colors or wonderful music or attractive smells or delicious foods or exciting movements, dance or song, and so on. The notion there was, of course, is that these kinds of rituals will get sealed in memory for a different reason from the ones that you do routinely. And that rather they are much more like what in the literature has been called flashbulb memory. Memory for extraordinary, unlikely events. And extraordinary memories for really quite unusual or rare events. I mean, the context in which this has been studied is principally things like where you were at on September the 11th, 2001. Everybody, pretty much, in the worlds that I take it, you and I and your audience live in are folks who remember where we were. But none of us remember where we were on September 10th or on September 12th in 2001. And so the notion is these are kinds of extraordinary memories, and the suggestion is that religions use rituals to create similar kinds of circumstances. And sort of so the more extreme the rituals are, the more impact they'll have and create these kinds of memories. It turns out the story is more complicated than either the Whitehouse or Lawson and McCauley or McCauley and Lawson thought 20 years ago. And there's just been fantastic research done. And this is one of the things that the cognitive science of religion, when I made kind of vague comments about methods and tools and that sort of thing of the cognitive sciences, that the cognitive sciences of religion have contributed to not only the study of religion, but also to cognitive science. And that is the interest in and the successful carrying out of experiments in the field. It's a very tough thing to do. I mentioned earlier the Siegel, Campbell, and Herskovitz from back in the 1960s looking at visual illusions across cultures. And it was the same thing. I mean, they did this. They taught anthropologists how to do experimental research, sent them out in the field. They knew the cultures. The cognitive science of religion has generated a whole host of researchers who are doing the same kind of thing, from Christine Laguerre at the University of Texas to Dimitris Zaglatis at the University of Connecticut, previously at Aarhus University in Denmark, working with that group. So one of the things they've done is to study extreme rituals. Zaglatis famously studied firewalking. Zaglatis and his colleagues, I should add. I mean, it's a whole group of folks at the University of Aarhus at that time. Mm-hmm. You talked about how, in your setup for this, that religions might sort of prepare minds for certain kinds of materials to ingest, as one might say, certain kinds of materials. And that's, to some extent, what they found about memory. And that was I'm not completely squaring with the analysis I just gave about the flashbulb stuff. What they found is that these guys who were doing the firewalking at the, within the first hour, the first minutes actually after they had done this, they claimed they didn't remember anything. I don't remember any of this. Well, this study is famous for a host of reasons. They put heart monitors on these guys, so they knew when they were excited and when they weren't, and that sort of thing. They had video cameras videotaping the entire proceeding, so they had a host of details about the episode that they had, as it were, clear evidence what the actual circumstances were. The famous finding, the famous finding was about the synchrony of people's heartbeats. But what deserves to be an equally famous finding was the finding about their memories. Because what they do, they were wise enough to know that you check memory at different retention intervals. So they asked them about what they remembered within the first hour or so after they had walked over hot coals. But then they came back and asked them 2 months later. And it turns out that the population had, across the population of firewalkers, they had a very different response. Now these guys said they remembered it very clearly. They were completely confident about what they remembered, and they were wrong as it stood with regard to what they had found in the videos. What's that mean? What they were completely confident about in the protocols they provided at 2 months was, one might say, the canonical standard story that, as it were, the culture propagates. They got many details. When they were asked about details of the events that occurred, they got them wrong. But they were completely confident that they had them right. But their wrong answers always went in the direction of sort of, one might say, sort of the canonical story of the culture about what firewalking was like. There is other, I've gone on, so maybe I should cut this off at this point, but there's other wonderful research that's arisen pertaining to ritual that shows rather similar sorts of findings and a host of similar, related phenomena that also lead to the sort of, one might say, the capacity of culture, and that we'll leave it as unexplicated right at the moment, but the ability of culture to impose on ritual participants uniform or comparatively uniform interpretations that facilitate the continued transmission of the system.
Okay, and apart from those aspects that you've just referred, isn't it also the case that rituals also help in reinforcing group identities?
Well, I made an allusion to the fact that Harvey has continued over the last couple decades since we had our exchanges to, frankly, I mean, he's been tremendously successful at obtaining funds and then enlisting really brilliant young researchers to collaborate with. And most of that research has been dedicated to precisely that topic. This has been a general direction as the of the system.
Okay, and apart from those aspects that you've just referred, isn't it also the case that rituals also help in reinforcing group identities?
Well, I made an allusion to the fact that Harvey has continued over the last couple decades since we had our exchanges to, frankly, I mean, he's been tremendously successful at obtaining funds and then enlisting really brilliant young researchers to collaborate with. And most of that research has been dedicated to precisely that topic. This has been a general direction as the cognitive story, the cognitive science of religion, which is interested in the proximate mechanisms, has come into more fruitful interaction with the evolutionary science of religion, which is interested in the ultimate mechanisms, the mechanisms of selection that pertain to religion. And whenever you introduce evolution, you're going to be interested in function. You're going to be interested in possibility of an adaptation as a result of selective forces. The major focus then has been on how much do imagistic patterns that Harvey has championed contribute to the growth of sort of what he calls identity fusion, the notion that your personal identity fuses with the identity of the group, that you are part of the collectivity. Again, I mentioned militaries as being interested in the same dynamics. This is exactly how militaries build small fighting units, is to use a metaphor that's been repeatedly used about the Americans' experience during the Second World War, bands of brothers. Mm-hmm. I could go on at some length about the variety of research that Harvey's generated out of this, and other colleagues as well. I mean, other folks in. But the general notion is that this aims to produce group solidarity, that it produces pro-social conduct amongst members of the group, that it promotes strong enforcement of group norms and group solidarity, cooperation. And that's a real advantage for groups.
Right. Okay, so let me just ask you another question that relates to methodology.
Groups.
Right. Okay, so let me just ask you another question that relates to methodology when it comes to the cognitive science of religion, and now specifically about the cultural aspects of it. So when we try to obtain sources of information from, for example, religious texts or even artistic pieces that are somewhat related to religion, isn't there at least to a certain extent, a risk that when we're interpreting those same texts that come from other cultures, that we could be imposing a mode of interpretation that is part of our own culture, and so we would be misinterpreting what they really mean by what is in that piece of religious text or that piece or that artistic piece, for example.
Yeah. Well, the first, let me first. This is a very different question from any of them we've. Yeah. Well, the first, let me first. This is a very different question from any of them we've discussed up to this point. Sure. My interests are principally explanatory interests, but actually in the very first chapter of the very first book that Tom Lawson and I wrote about the cognitive science of religion, we argued that there is and should always be a fruitful interaction between explanatory and interpretive projects. Do people often impose their own cultural norms and understandings on patterns they see in other groups? I don't think there's any question about that. I think I probably do it every day. Do we thereby fail to capture, quote, what they mean, to use a phrase I think that you used? Well, I don't know. Sometimes I'm sure we do, but I suppose that at one level, the cognitive science of religion also is trying to raise a set of questions about that interpretive presumption. There's ample roots for a certain kind of, at least, you talked about weak Worfianism. I'll talk about a certain sort of weak skepticism about meaning here at this point. That is to say that there is something that they mean. I don't want to go off on those philosophical side roads right now, but other than to say that I've always been sympathetic to a certain kind of wariness about this, as the term just seems to me to be getting more and more flexible as to what sorts of things might mean and what meanings are and so on. I don't try not to do much of the interpretive work. To be honest, I'm not clever enough. Interpreters sometimes come up with incredibly insightful comments and analyses of cultural phenomena, and they are genuinely inspirational. The scientist's job is to take suggestive, insightful comments and to try to render them as precisely as possible, and to try to render them empirically tractable, and finally, ideally, empirically testable. Some ideas pan out, and some ideas don't pan out when we push them this way. Of course, there's a constant interplay, because the interpreter may insist, no, that particular attempt to try to to use the old language of the logical empirist, to operationalize my concept, in fact, misses its import. And so then the scientist, if they're really dedicated to that project, would say, okay, well, then what's wrong about it, and how do we repair that? Interpreters are incredibly, as I said, often insightful and clever, but don't ever underestimate the insight and cleverness of especially people in the behavioral sciences to come up with, and in the cognitive sciences, frankly, to come up with the most remarkably inventive and comparably clever ways of getting at new sources of evidence that might bear on these concepts. From putting heart monitors on firewalkers to, by the way, the firewalkers were also, it turns out, quite wrong about when they were excited in the course of the firewalk. They all said they were as cool as cucumbers 2 months later when they walked across the fire. It, I suppose, comes as no great shock. They were not cool. They were incredibly excited. That's what their heart monitors showed. But, from putting heart monitors on firewalkers and then testing their memory as it stands against that objective measure, to a study that I learned about recently, in which Joe Henrich is looking at the number of parking tickets that diplomats to the United Nations get, and divvying them out by what countries the diplomats hail from, and what it shows about the cultures they're in. Yeah.
Okay. So at this point, perhaps we could introduce the topic of studying religion from an evolutionary perspective, because there are several different criteria that we can take into account, and I know that you, Dr. McCauley, have a very interesting slide that you would like to share with us and to tell us about. So could you please Okay, so at this point, perhaps we could introduce the topic of studying religion from an evolutionary perspective, because there are several different criteria that we can take into account, and I know that you, Dr. McCauley, have a very interesting slide that you would like to share with us and to tell us about. So could you please share it with us now?
Okay, we're going to try. I want to again emphasize I'm no expert on evolutionary theory or even evolutionary perspectives on religion. One minor attempt to try to bring some clarity, though, to the discussion has centered on this slide. What I'm out to do is at least to get folks to, and frankly to help me understand the diversity of positions, possible positions that are out there. I'm sort of creating a little 3-by-3 table here by looking at 3 different mechanisms of selection and 3 different levels of selection. That is to say, natural selection, sexual selection, and then, of course, more recently, the rise because of Boyd and Richardson, and because of Henrik and that whole, what Cecilia Hayes calls the California group, I think it is. But actually, Pete Richardson's the only one that's still in California, but of the interest in cultural selection. The levels of selection, and this is connected with the question about the units of selection. Are genes the units? Are individuals the units? Are groups the units? I already have a question mark built into the notion that there could be natural selection at the group level, because it's such a highly controversial topic. My understanding, I don't again pretend to expertise on this, but my understanding is the overwhelming majority of biological researchers are unsympathetic to that view. There are a few folks out there who have tried to defend it, and actually some fairly famous folks. I'll say a bit about that. But what I'll focus on quickly is, with regard to religion and evolutionary accounts of religion. So, first of all, there are folks. Robin Dunbar, Joseph Babuya, Jesse Beering, Rich Sosis, who have just wanted to argue that there's natural selection for features of human conduct and mental life, principally conduct, that have just been selected for, naturally selected for. So pertaining to things like our sort of certain moral sensibilities and interest in sort of making sure we go on folks and do well in groups and protect our reputations and that sort of thing. So at least they're inclined to tell the story there. Most of our discussion today has been about the byproduct theorists, among whom I include myself. People like Pascal Boyer, Justin Barrett, of course, Tom Lawson as well. I would stress that we too think that there's been natural selection for mechanisms, cognitive mechanisms that pertain to religions, but sorry, I should be careful about how I say that, but don't directly pertain to religion. The point again is that they are byproducts of the operation of those systems that have evolved or are in place for very, very different reasons. I mean, we don't have a contamination avoidance system because there was evolution for developing a concept of sacred spaces. We have a contamination avoidance system because we need to avoid contaminants. Mm-hmm. In the last decade or so, there's been a host of folks, more than a decade now, I guess a couple decades, who have been interested in sort of raising the possibility that sexual selection might be a mechanism that could be employed in the accounting of religion. That is to say that, among other things, especially in sort of large-scale societies where we've got competing proselytizing religions, for example, communicating clearly that you're going to be a good mate, that you're going to be faithful, and that you're going to, among other things, care for your young and that sort of thing, would contribute to your fitness. And these are things that are, as it were, sort of certified by religions. Where an awful lot of the action has been, of course, is in this new framework of cultural selection and the notion of gene-culture coevolution. That would be, in that first level there, cultural selection for genes. The famous parade case, of course, is a gene for creating long-term lactose tolerance so that you can drink milk and have a new source of protein. And nourishment, but a whole host of folks. I mean, actually, I could have put Harvey Whitehouse in this group as well, and others. There is, you'll notice that the name Wilson, David Sloan Wilson in this case I'm referring to, is in two boxes here. And this pertains to an ambiguity that arises in the discussion of these matters around this concept of what is called group selection. The problem is that group selection is an ambiguous term. That is to say, it could mean cultural group selection, which is to say that there's group selection, in terms of cultural selection, there can be selection for groups, and that's a concept that's alive and well. But then there has also been a much longer and older argument about whether or not there might be group selection, natural selection at the group level. And as I said, that's been more controversial, but David Sloan Wilson has been one of those people who has prominently argued for both. That actually, in some ways, the first one can be captured by pointing out that Scott Atran and Joe Henrich subsequently have written a paper in which they make the point I want to make right now, and that is there are 9 possibilities here. 2 of them might be problematic. There don't seem to be too many folks out there arguing for those 2, but the other 7 are alive and well. And a crucial point to make about these is that they're not mutually exclusive or exhaustive. Not mutually exclusive, I should say. That is to say that all 7 of those positions could easily have parts of truth about a variety of different features of religion. Harvey, Whitehouse, and John Landman have argued for fractionating religion, and the notion that the way the cognitive science of religion and the way the evolutionary science of religion both operate is to not try to sort of give an account of religion as a whole, but rather to look at features of religions, recurrent features that are frequent and popular, and to see if there's a cognitive and or evolutionary story to be told about them. I think we can get back to us here, so let me go ahead. People, I presume, have gotten the picture there, so to speak, quite literally. That's my attempt to try to say something worthwhile about these topics. I want to. My sense is that I found. And I guess I'd be tempted to say reasonably compelling arguments for positions in all of those 7 viable cells of that 3x3 matrix.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but when we're approaching religion from an evolutionary perspective and we're trying to analyze if it really contributed to people's inclusive fitness, or, for example, if we consider group selection to groups of humans being more successful than others, if, for example, one of them had religion and the other lacked it, or something like that. I mean, we're not saying anything about the role that religion might play in modern industrial scientific societies, right? Because it could be a different one, and perhaps there are nowadays some aspects of the religion that, even if from an evolutionary perspective they might be beneficial, perhaps in our current environments they are a little bit more problematic, or not.
Well, there are at least 2 levels at which I'd answer that question. One has to do with rather more straightforward scientific concerns pertaining to evolutionary matters. The other would be sort of intellectual concern at just a sort of general intellectual level. There is evidence. Mike McCauley, again, at the University of Miami, actually one of Deborah Lieberman's colleagues there, is probably one of the best researchers on this topic. But, in short, finding that there's lots of evidence, at least in America, that participation in religion is pretty good for your mental health and for your social well-being. These folks live longer, they get sick less, they report being happier, and all those good things. So, I mean, prima facie, there's some evidence about that. As we were discussing a little earlier, arising out of the cultural evolution story and the cultural evolution theoreticians, there's become a great deal of interest about the ability of religions to produce groups that are, as it were, more competitive, that they are able to have groups that are where folks experience solidarity, where they cooperate with one another. I mean, this is, I think, to be taken seriously. Rodney Stark, in his wonderful book on the rise of Christianity, although it was written prior to this emergence of this sort of theoretical material, just a sort of set of historical observations, provides fairly interesting evidence for this kind of claim. His argument, in short, is that Christianity really impressed the Romans because the Christians did things like take care of their fellow Christians when they would get the plague, and they didn't run off to the hinterlands; they stayed and helped people. There's reasons to think that sort of similar kinds of things may have been happening in Japan, and that this led to sort of the closing of Japan in the early 17th century, because the wealthy classes were, seeing this religion suddenly potentially beginning to spread quite rapidly amongst the peasants, and that wasn't what they wanted. The notion that religion could be functional in these ways and therefore could be the target of selection, I think is, as I've said, my view is I've seen plausible stories with empirical support. Is absolutely compelling that cinches the case? No. But that's always true about science. There's never empirical evidence that just absolutely settles every question. That just isn't the way science works. There's always new questions we can raise. What we have to do is look at the balance of the evidence that's available and go out and seek more evidence to try to adjudicate these questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think this would be a good point to introduce what I alluded to before. Okay, so I think this would be a good point to introduce what I alluded to before in terms of what you deal with in your book, why religion is natural and science is not. So we've already gone through some of the big cognitive bases for religion, and I guess that in the previous question, when I talked about how religion operates in a modern scientific world, when I referred to the scientific part, perhaps I was trying to allude to what I'm going to ask now. That is, so what is the problem here when it comes to the relationship between science and religion? When it comes to science, perhaps trying to promote knowledge about the world that is really sort of counterintuitive. Okay. Sure. I mean, what I've argued is that science sooner or later always traffics in conceptions, theories, and views that are counterintuitive, and in fact, frankly, usually radically counterintuitive. This is in contrast to the suggestion that has indeed arisen out of the cognitive science of religion, interesting pertaining to a host of cognitive issues we've already talked about memory and so on, that religious representations, by contrast, tend to be, the term I've preferred to use is very modestly counterintuitive. They make a little change in the rules in either the physical domain or the biological domain or the psychological domain, so that a saint can fly, or somebody can heal someone by just touching them, or
someone else can read someone else's mind with complete confidence and accuracy, in contrast to the kind of conjecture that we all are operating with in our theory of mind. The argument is, by contrast, science produces representations that sort of minor little changes or transfers of intuitive notions, but really that overwhelm and turn our intuitive conceptions upside down. And this is, I've argued, why I'm described science as unnatural. Again, I don't think it's rooted in those maturationally natural proclivities of mind. In fact, it tends to overthrow verdicts that those offer. But it's also not easy, and it's unnatural in that sense as well. It's not easy to even take, I could try to turn, if I really were competent, I could try to turn to talk about esoteric areas of science that I frankly don't really know that much about. But I can illustrate this easily enough with plenty of far more readily understandable and more widely understandable scientific conceptions. Because the most basic of, in the history of modern science, the most basic finding that in effect ignited the entire cultural movement to do science was the Copernican revolution. We do not have any intuitions about the fact that we are moving right now, that the Earth is spinning 1,000 miles an hour. That is just not something that is served up by our maturationally natural capacities, but that's what our best science tells us. Our best science tells us that even solid objects, in fact, are mostly empty space. Ever since Darwin, our best science tells us that species are not immutable and do not have some essence that, as it were, keeps them hermetically sealed from the standpoint of their propagation. I've used physical examples, I've used biological examples, psychological examples. In short, one might argue all of cognitive science is an illustration of this, to the extent that our sort of folk psychological conception, our common sense psychology says that, we have a conscious mind, it carries out thought and inference, and it's on the basis of the beliefs that it possesses because of those processes that we do what we do. But a great deal of cognitive science says, well, actually, a whole lot of the things that we do are based on these sorts of systems that are basically below the level of consciousness, that are automatic and not reflective,
and we don't really have direct access to them, right?
Sure, and that we have to use very, very subtle and sophisticated means of experimentation and so on to get evidence about. But, likewise, as we do cognitive neuroscience and the new exciting accomplishments of these areas of inquiry over the last couple of decades with imaging and so on, out of clinical areas. One of my favorite illustrations is Anton syndrome. Anton syndrome is a pathology. It's not it's not as if it's so esoteric that people have never heard about it. People who work in the clinical world know about Anton syndrome because there are folks in sort of every major city, probably in the world, where there's a few patients who have this problem. But what's the problem? From the standpoint of folk psychology, it makes no sense whatsoever. That is to say, people with Anton syndrome experience blindness denial. They're blind, and they don't know that they're blind. And on the face of it, that just seems conceptually impossible. But in fact, empirically, there are lots of folks with Anton syndrome in the world. They don't number the millions, but they are out there, and we know they exist. Likewise, a host of other pathologies, heavy neglect, people who deny that half of their body is their own. These are radically counterintuitive accounts of these various parts of the world that we're talking about. The suggestion is, by contrast, of course, what I've been arguing and through most of our interview is that religion, in fact, relies on very ordinary cognition that has just, as I've suggested, these very, very minor little, modestly counterintuitive representations.
Okay. And so, in that sense, and with all of that in mind, should we say that, even though this is very controversial to say because it immediately gets associated with postmodernist approaches and things like that, that science is a sociocultural construct?
Oh, of course science is a sociocultural construct. What else could it be? But I don't think there are any sort of strong conclusions that follow its epistemic status. I mean, any kind of inquiry is a social cultural construct.
Okay. And so, in that sense, and with all of that in mind, should we say that, even though this is very controversial to say because it immediately gets associated with postmodernist approaches and things like that, that science is a sociocultural construct?
Oh, of course science is a sociocultural construct. What else could it be? But I don't think there are any sort of strong conclusions that follow its epistemic status. I mean, any kind of inquiry is a social cultural construct. Let alone, bases for sort of generating any kind of, in short, from a sort of classical standpoint, these kind of radically skeptical positions that folks who call themselves postmodernists are sometimes seen want to endorse. That science is a sociocultural construct is certainly true. Science is not perfect. Science is utterly fallible. It's very young. We've only been doing it in a kind of at all systematic and serious way for a few hundred years. It's constantly changing because we keep going back and trying to find new ways to bring new forms of evidence to bear. And that sometimes leads to very provocative changes in theories. But it seems to me that none of this bears on how we would assess it epistemically. A phrase I've used, taking advantage of a phrase that of one of our a phrase I've used, taking advantage of a phrase that one of our former American presidents used to use. He just died, George Bush. But in describing to the American voters and the American people the American defense establishment, he said that his aim was always that we would be second to none. And from an epistemic standpoint, that's my view about science. That is to say, it's second to none, but it doesn't follow that it's first. It doesn't follow that it's always right. It's with regard to sort of sorting out these matters about the empirical world, it's second to none currently. There are other ways we could get information. We may just be lucky and guess some certain things that are right. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps just one last question, and since we've already talked here about the benefits that religion has both at the individual and collective levels, even in our modern industrialized scientific societies, let's say, do you think that one of the ways by which religion and science might be compatible with one another is if we separate them in terms of science being a tool that we use to describe the world and about facts about the world, and religion about morality and values?
Yeah, what you're describing right now is a position that, at least in my experience, was best sort of probably laid out at length by Stephen Jay Gould in his book Rocks of Ages, in which he described the so-called two magisteria, right? As you quite correctly put, the notion that science is concerned with description, explanation, prediction, that sort of thing of the empirical world, and that religion is dedicated to values and morality and meaning and those sorts of things. I mean, I'm sympathetic with any folks who are trying to find peace, but that particular approach strikes me as perhaps peace at too high of a price, which is to say, I'm not quite so sympathetic with that particular account of things, and indeed have argued against it. Well, why? Well, first of all, of a piece with something I was just saying before, there are neither religion nor science are the sole authorities in these domains that Gould was inclined to attribute to them. As I was saying before, I mean, science is fallible, and the world is complex, and life is short. And the fact of the matter is, an awful lot of the time, we haven't got science worked out for a host of problems that we face, and science is hard to acquire. It takes lots of hard work, and so in the meantime, we're often stuck just sort of muddling along as well as we can with the equipment that Mother Nature gave us. Likewise, I mean, with regard to meaning or with regard to morality, I mean, the problem with religions, although there are certainly some that aspire to universality, particularly the proselytizing religions, nonetheless, it's, as we well know, there isn't any that has achieved that ascendancy, their aspirations to do so notwithstanding. And so their ability to sort of settle questions of meaning and morality are, it seems to me, always up in the air, if not for any other reason, just the competition amongst religions themselves, let alone the notion that there might be non-religious bases for raising what we find really engaging and interesting questions, at least questions as old as those that Plato talked about, that look like they're quite independent of any kind of religious take on meaning or morality. The other reason why I'm not so enamored of this particular approach is that it seems to me that it involves, interestingly enough, especially with religion, a kind of what I've sometimes called a sort of normative sleight of hand. A little bit of trickery might be not quite the right word I want to use here, but it, behind all of the gentle talk that's out there about so-called true religion, right? True religion about meaning and morality and that sort of thing. It's advanced sometimes, certainly by many religious people. It's advanced sometimes by theologians. It's advanced sometimes, often by academics. To say, and Gould, as I'll point out in just a second, says some things like this. But who gets to decide what true religion is? On what basis is that kind of call made? And whether we like it or not, I mean, lots of folks who are going around in the world we live in right now, blowing themselves up and killing other innocent people, are doing so unequivocally for reasons that they regard as religious reasons. So the notion that sort of religion has this corner on morality or meaning looks to me like it's problematic. But at a rather different level, Gould famously in his book, I mean, being one of the great evolutionary thinkers of our time, right, was attacking creationists. And his insistence that, in effect, creationism doesn't represent true religion or real religion or the magisterium of religion, right? And I just find this unacceptable. That is to say, to hold that position is in effect to say that the religious sensibilities of literally hundreds of millions of people don't count. Mm-hmm. Even though they feel and conceive of themselves as unequivocally doing and carrying out and living a religious life and so on. The pronouncement that, well, creationists don't count as part of the magisterium of religion seems to me to be, as I said, a kind of normative sleight of hand. Also, religions, as indeed creationists illustrate, but I mean, religions are interested in all kinds of explanatory questions. And frankly, I don't think that explanation and meaning can be separated so neatly, and or even explanation and morality can be so easily separated. That they interpenetrate one another, and that routinely when we're discussing moral issues, we're making all sorts of presumptions about the way the empirical world works and how you explain it and how it operates. So this notion that sort of we're going to be able to kind of sequester the two, and that's the way, sort of getting peace by giving them each of their own territory and letting them rule those territories. Like I said, I'm sympathetic with the notion that it's always a good thing to try to achieve peace, but I don't think this is the way to do it.
Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, so Dr. McCauley, we've already gone through a lot of information today, so just before we go, I will be leaving links in the description box of this video to your books and some of your articles and stuff like that, but would you like to make reference to perhaps some online resources if people want to get in touch with more of your work, or even the cognitive science of religion in general?
Oh, sure. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. To be honest, probably for folks who are not academics or experts on these areas, but have genuine, intellectual interests in these matters, probably as readily accessible and kind of readable as anything is the blog that I write for Psychology Today. If you go to the Psychology Today website, they've got in their blogs, they have them categorized. Mine is listed under Cognition as it's sort of the group area, and mine has got the same title as my book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. I think by now I've got about 50 or 60 of them posted there, and about a host of issues that I think, frankly, members of your audience would likely find of some interest, and usually giving either a cognitive or an evolutionary or both slant on sort of the topics in question. So yeah, I think that might be as good as anything. I should add there, in some of those there are also references and then links likewise to the more technical stuff.
Okay, so I will include that in the description of this interview, Dr. McCauley. And just before we go, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. We did 2 hours here, so you were really generous with your time, and I mean, it was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ricardo. I mean, of course, it might have been generous, but it also might have been long-winded. But thank you, and it was really a pleasure. Good to talk to you. I hope we cross paths sometime.
Okay, thank you. Hi guys, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end. I'm recording a new ending just to let you know a couple of new things, but I mean, I've started this channel in February 2018 and I've been putting out a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And if you don't like Patreon or prefer other platforms, you can also go to PayPal and subscribe from $1 to $20. I have all of those options in the description box of the video, and you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal. And also you can go to Subscribestar and pledge any amount there, so you have all of those options to support the channel. And so before I go, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, and I'm very proud of this, my first producer, Isar Webb. Thank you for all.